On a gloomy, blizzard-filled day, renowned best-selling novelist Paul was driving along a winding mountain road. He had just finished writing a new book and was heading to New York to submit the manuscript. As the snow intensified and the road grew narrower, Paul's car suddenly lost control, tumbling off the slope. Trapped in his car and buried in snow, Paul seemed doomed. Fortunately, a passerby pried open the car door and rescued the severely injured, unconscious Paul. However, this was only the beginning of a nightmare. When Paul woke up, he found himself lying in a warm room. A middle-aged woman he didn't know was carefully tending to him. The woman introduced herself as Annie, Paul's #1 fan, who had saved him. Annie explained that the blizzard had closed the mountain roads and disrupted communication, making it impossible to take Paul to a hospital or contact anyone. For now, she had brought him to her home to recover. Although Paul survived, his injuries were severe. Both legs were shattered and swollen like pig's trotters, and his right arm was broken as well. He could only lie in bed. Luckily, Annie was a former nurse and had the necessary medication and equipment at home. She treated Paul's injuries professionally, and under her attentive care, his condition gradually improved. Paul was grateful to this kind woman, considering his survival a miracle. After all, the road was rarely traveled, let alone during a blizzard. However, Annie claimed it was no coincidence. As Paul's self-proclaimed #1 fan, she knew all of his habits. She was aware that Paul often visited a small-town inn to write in solitude and search for inspiration. On the day of the accident, Annie had followed him out of concern for the dangerous weather, which allowed her to save him in time. She also retrieved Paul's latest manuscript and asked to read it. Grateful, Paul agreed. Unexpectedly, after reading the manuscript, Annie, who had been gentle and polite, became agitated and dissatisfied. She criticized the novel's children for using vulgar language, calling it unrefined. Paul explained that he had once lived in the slums where children spoke that way. This infuriated Annie, who had grown up in the slums herself. Her emotions spiraled out of control and she seemed like a different person. After calming down, Annie apologized repeatedly, reaffirming her admiration for Paul. Despite her apology, Paul began to feel uneasy. He suspected something was mentally wrong with her. All he wanted now was for the roads and communication to be restored so he could leave the isolated cabin. However, whenever he asked, Annie insisted repairs were still underway. One day, Annie returned from town with a copy of Paul's recently published novel, the final installment of the Misery series. Annie loved this series dearly and had memorized even the heroine's lines. During the darkest period of her life, when her husband left her, the Misery novels were her only comfort. Annie passionately rambled on about how much she loved the story. Impatient, Paul asked about the status of the roads and communication again. Annie claimed the phone was still broken and the roads remained closed, but she had contacted Paul's agent from town. She assured him to focus on his recovery. A few nights later, Paul was abruptly awakened by the sound of his door opening. Annie stood at his bedside, her expression dark. She had stayed up for days reading the final book and was devastated to find that Paul had killed off her beloved heroine. In a hysterical rage, Annie accused Paul of being a despicable murderer and even raised a flower stand to smash him. Terrified, Paul called out her name, regaining a sliver of her sanity. Instead of striking him, she threw the flower stand against the wall. Coldly, Annie revealed that she had never contacted his agent. No one knew where Paul was, and no one would come to rescue him. After Annie left, Paul, in great pain, crawled to the door, only to discover it was locked. He realized with horror that he was imprisoned by this deranged woman, not a fan, but an obsessive stalker. The next day, Annie dragged a barbecue grill into the room and forced Paul to burn his new manuscript, calling it vulgar cultural garbage. Reluctantly, Paul complied, watching his hard work turn to ashes as Annie smiled with satisfaction. At that moment, the sound of a helicopter echoed overhead. The town's sheriff was conducting an aerial search for Paul. It turned out that Paul's agent, worried after losing contact with him for days, had called the town's police. The sheriff, the only officer in the area, began searching for Paul himself. He discovered signs of the car accident but could not find the snow-buried vehicle. Desperate, he enlisted a rescue helicopter to continue the search, but the heavy snow made the task difficult. As the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, Annie sighed in relief. She left 2 painkillers for Paul and then exited the room. However, this time, Paul did not take the pills. Instead, he carefully hid them. He knew that if taken in large amounts, the medication could cause unconsciousness. So, he devised a plan to save himself. Paul planned to accumulate enough pills to knock Annie out and escape from this nightmare. Day by day, Paul would stash away the painkillers, hiding them in the mattress. As time went on, his injuries improved. Although his right arm was still in a sling, he could now sit in a wheelchair and perform simple movements. One day, Annie brought home a typewriter and some printing paper, demanding that Paul rewrite the Misery series, changing the previous ending and reviving the female protagonist. With no other choice, Paul agreed to her request. At this moment, he noticed a hairpin on the floor. An idea struck him, and he found an excuse. He claimed the printing paper Annie bought was of poor quality and smudged the ink, suggesting she purchase a new batch. Although visibly annoyed, Annie left for the town again. Seizing the opportunity, Paul used the hairpin to unlock the door and wheeled himself out. His first instinct was to unlock the front door, but it was tightly locked. He then moved to the living room to look for a phone to call for help. His wheelchair nearly knocked over a ceramic ornament on the coffee table, but he caught it just in time and put it back. After finally finding a telephone, he discovered it was just an empty shell. It couldn't make calls. He then entered the storage room and took a roll of capsules to hide on his person. Next, he made his way to the kitchen and found a back door leading outside. However, the kitchen entrance was narrow, forcing Paul to struggle out of his wheelchair and crawl painfully toward the door. Unfortunately, the back door was also locked. Just then, he heard the sound of a car outside. Annie had returned from town. Paul quickly crawled back to his wheelchair, returned to the room, and locked the door behind him. Luckily, Annie didn't seem to notice anything unusual. Later, Paul secretly opened one of the capsules and tasted the powder inside. It didn't have any noticeable odor. He then dismantled all the capsules and collected the powder into a small paper pouch for future use. Meanwhile, as the snow began to melt, the sheriff finally discovered Paul's car. The car door had signs of being pried open, and there was no body inside. The sheriff concluded that someone must have rescued Paul. To search for more clues, he even purchased all of Paul's novels and studied them carefully. Back at Annie's house, she continued to care for Paul to keep him focused on writing. To maintain Annie's trust, Paul cooperated with her fully. He started rewriting the novel's ending as requested, and their relationship appeared harmonious on the surface. One day, Paul suggested that they celebrate the protagonist's resurrection by having dinner together. Annie happily agreed and prepared a lavish meal. At dinner, Paul deliberately asked to light some candles to make the occasion more formal and romantic. When Annie left to fetch the candles, Paul secretly poured the painkiller powder into her glass of wine. However, as they clinked glasses, Annie inexplicably knocked over one of the candles. While picking it up, she clumsily spilled the wine all over the floor. It seemed like an accident, but Paul was devastated. His plan had failed, leaving him helpless but still wearing a polite smile. In the days that followed, Paul kept up the pretense of diligently writing while secretly using the typewriter as a makeshift weight to strengthen his arms. His right arm had long since healed, but he kept this hidden from Annie. The novel was nearing its conclusion, and Paul's legs were also improving. However, Annie's mental state deteriorated once again. On a stormy night, she entered Paul's room, visibly disheveled and holding a gun. She muttered about how much she loved Paul and accused him of not loving her in return. She feared that once he finished the new novel and his legs healed, he would leave her forever. The only way to keep him with her was to kill him. Paul was terrified, but Annie didn't follow through. Instead, she left the room, driving off in her car. Once alone, Paul crawled to the kitchen and grabbed a fruit knife for self-defense. In the living room, he found a scrapbook containing photographs of Annie as a child and newspaper clippings about Paul. Horrified, he discovered that people around Annie, whether family or friends, had mysteriously died over the years. Annie had worked as a nurse, and the hospital she was employed at had experienced several suspicious deaths. All the deaths appeared connected to Annie, and although she had been arrested, there wasn't enough evidence to convict her, so she was released. The more Paul read, the more terrified he became. Determined to fight back, he hid the fruit knife in the sling, supporting his right arm. He then returned to bed and began practicing stabbing motions repeatedly. After waiting a long time, Annie finally returned. However, instead of entering the room, she simply stood silently outside the door. Exhausted, Paul didn't wait any longer. After hiding the knife, he fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up in the middle of the night, Annie was once again standing beside his bed with a dark expression. Annie quickly injected Paul with a sedative, and he immediately passed out. When Paul woke up again, it was daylight, and he found himself tightly bound to the bed. Annie had discovered the hairpin Paul used to unlock the door and the hidden fruit knife. She told Paul that she had known he had gone to the living room because the items on the coffee table had been moved, and the manuscript she left was intentional. She wanted to see how Paul would react after knowing everything about her. Unfortunately, Paul's actions disappointed her. Since Paul didn't want to stay willingly, Annie decided to take matters into her own hands. She grabbed a block of wood, placed it between Paul's legs, and then brutally broke his ankles with a sledgehammer.
Almost done. Just one more.
Paul passed out from the excruciating pain. When he woke up, Annie had already bandaged his wounds, but Paul had lost all hope of survival or escape. However, the town's old sheriff hadn't given up on finding Paul. One day, while Annie was in town shopping, she got into an argument over a minor issue. The sheriff witnessed the commotion and suddenly remembered something. During her trial, Annie had defended herself using the exact same lines as the heroine in Paul's novels. This strange coincidence sparked his suspicion. The sheriff went to the town's only bookstore to ask around. The shop owner revealed that Annie was a die-hard fan of Paul's books. She had recently bought a typewriter and frequently came back to purchase high-quality printing paper. Relying on his years of investigative experience, the sheriff suspected Annie might be holding Paul captive. He immediately drove to Annie's house. Hearing the sound of a car, the alert Annie quickly injected Paul with another sedative and hid him in the basement. By the time the sheriff entered the house, all traces of Paul had been erased. Annie calmly explained that she was writing a novel and hoped to become a writer like Paul. The sheriff searched the house but found nothing unusual and left. However, as he was about to leave, he heard strange noises. Paul had woken up and was shouting for help. Following the sound, the sheriff discovered the basement's hidden door. Just as he was about to rescue Paul, Annie appeared and shot him with a hunting rifle. Calmly, Annie told Paul that she planned to kill him and then take her own life, so they could be together forever. Just as Annie was about to act, Paul had a clever idea. He told Annie that he didn't mind dying, but the novel still needed an ending. If she gave him just one more day, he would write a perfect conclusion for her favorite heroine. Moved by his words, Annie agreed. While Annie left to fetch a wheelchair, Paul secretly hid a can of lighter fluid in his clothes. The next morning, Paul finally completed the ending of the novel, which made Annie ecstatic. As usual, she brought him a bottle of champagne, a glass, a match, and a cigarette. Paul's traditional way of celebrating finishing a book. Paul told Annie that she should prepare 2 glasses because this book was a collaboration between them. Touched, Annie nearly cried and turned to fetch another glass. Seizing the moment, Paul doused the manuscript in lighter fluid. When Annie returned, he struck a match and set the manuscript on fire. Annie, horrified, lunged at the burning manuscript. Paul grabbed the typewriter and smashed it against Annie's head. A violent struggle broke out, and during the fight, Annie tripped, hit her head on the typewriter again, and fell unconscious. Paul crawled toward the door, but Annie, bloodied and enraged, suddenly attacked him again, pinning him down. In a final struggle, Paul picked up a heavy iron ornament and struck Annie's head repeatedly, finally killing her. Shortly after Annie's death, the police rescued Paul. His actions were deemed self-defense. 18 months later, Paul had recovered from his leg injuries and published the novel Annie Had Destroyed. The book received widespread acclaim from critics. While dining at a restaurant, Paul's agent asked if he wanted to turn his harrowing experience into another novel. Paul was unsure. At that moment, Paul saw Annie, dressed as a waitress, walking toward him with a knife, only to realize it was just a hallucination. The real waitress, an ordinary young woman, smiled and said, "I'm your #1 fan." This sent a shiver down Paul's spine, and the movie ends here. The story is adapted from the novel Misery by the master of suspense, Stephen King. Aside from the thrilling storyline, the performances in this film are exceptional. Kathy Bates, in particular, delivered an unforgettable portrayal of a disturbed and deranged woman. Her performance was so outstanding that she won the Best Actress Oscar for this role, an achievement that's quite rare for a thriller film. That's all for today's recap. See you in the next one.